Jonathan Ashbach is assistant professor of politics at the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership at the University of Toledo. He is the editor of Winning the Crowd, The Politics of Popular Film, and his popular work has appeared in both scholarly and popular avenues, including the Review of Politics, American Political Thought, Christianity Today, and the Public Discourse. Ashbach holds a Ph.D. in politics from Hillsdale College. His areas of teaching and research include the American Constitutionalism, the liberal and conservative traditions, political theology, and the politics of literature and film.
Well, good morning. I've been asked to speak about James Madison and give a perspective of one particularly important founder on the question of federalism, sort of work through in detail how Madison approaches these matters. And this is an important question to parse carefully if we're going to teach American history and American government correctly. I'm going to try and orient much of this talk towards understanding why a widespread myth about this topic is false. For some of you who have a fairly decent general familiarity with the founding era, or perhaps for some who have even done more specialized reading on Madison himself, you may well have come across a thesis that's known as the Madison problem. This myth, the myth of the Madison problem, is pretty roundly rejected by the relatively few scholars who specialize in Madison's own thought. But it probably remains the dominant conventional wisdom among scholars of the American founding, that era generally. So to start out with, what is this alleged Madison problem? Basically, it's the claim that Madison was radically inconsistent across different periods of his career in terms of the kind of union that he wanted and that he asserted that the U.S. was. This story begins in the 1780s with a radically nationalistic James Madison who more or less wanted to abolish the states. He was disgusted with the Articles of Confederation, wanted to create a purely national government, far more nationalistic than the Constitution would end up being, and he defends a nationalistic interpretation of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers. Then the 1790s roll around. Madison reacts against Hamilton's economic agenda in the new government, and all of a sudden we have, it's claimed, this radically states' rights-oriented Madison who goes so far as to claim that the nation is really nothing more than a confederacy. And here's in large part the crux of the issue, that the states have the right to interpose to prevent the enforcement of federal laws within their boundaries. And then, finally, the Revolution of 1800 takes place, Madison's Democratic Republican Party takes power, and with his fears of Federalist policy alleviated, Madison now goes back to being nationalist again, most specifically in the 1820s and 30s, when he denounces South Carolina's nullificationist theories, which the Madison problem myth generally sees as being more or less equivalent to state interposition. So, is Madison in favor of interposition/nullification? Is he against it? Is he both, depending on when it benefits him? The answer to these questions is actually going to be relatively simple, but in order to get to that simple answer, we're going to have to work through in some detail a fairly complicated way of thinking about federalism, or about authority in governance generally, in order to understand the categories that Madison's using. We have to start, in fact, way back at the very political beginning, which for Madison is a state of nature. Human beings possess by nature certain rights and needs that can only be protected and provided for effectively in political community. But humans are naturally equal in the sense that they're equal in authority. No one has any authority to rule another person. Every person has full authority under God to rule him or herself. And so by nature, there is no legitimate governance. Any political rule is going to have to be constructed artificially. That construction, that social contract, is going to be a question of taking that inherent authority and distributing it to political authorities. Kind of the question of authority for Madison is the central question that will play out in these things. I used the word social contract a moment ago. Madison usually says social compact. These are close enough for our purposes, I think, to use them interchangeably, although they're not precisely the same. But to be technical, the distinction I do want to make is that for Madison, we actually have to talk about not just one social compact, but two of them. The first social compact, or what Madison sometimes calls the societal compact, is the agreement by which isolated individuals in a state of nature bind themselves together into a political society. Now, for us moderns, society, no article, generally means a sort of quasi-private, quasi-public realm where we can do things without getting the government involved, and it's kind of vague and amorphous. Discard that thought. Crumple it up, throw it away. That's not what Madison means. For Madison, a political society is a society just like any other formal grouping of people might be, except it has more comprehensive ends. It's 100% public, it's 100% political, and it is in fact the main locus of governance at all times. What it means to join a first social compact, to become part of a political society, is that one transfers the authority to govern almost all areas of one's life to this new artificial person that is the society, incorporating oneself into it to become a part of a whole. That incorporation is really fairly drastic. If some of you lean libertarian, I don't want to make your hair stand up on end, but when Madison starts talking about what a political society may require of its members, he starts using all purposes whatsoever type language. His most precise formulation is that a society has the authority to demand of its members anything they could innocently do. If it's not positively immoral for you to do X, your society has the authority to demand that you do it, and that decision is made by simple majority vote. Whatever 50% plus one vote of the members in the society choose, that's what the society requires. Okay, now before that sounds too terrifying, good news, there are some limits here. First, societies are only authorized to pursue the end goals of the first social compact. Remember, individuals don't just hand themselves over to a society for no reason. They have rights that they want protected, and they want to establish better conditions for flourishing. Those ends might be broad, but they are finite. And so if a society begins to systematically act contrary to those ends, people have a right to revolt. They have a right to say, no, this is usurpation. It's not legitimate. Second, the means that a society uses to those ends must respect the equality of the society's members. This also ties back to Madison's philosophical starting points. Because each person in the state of nature possesses equal authority, says Madison, no one's subject to anyone else's rule, no one would voluntarily void that equal status by agreeing to a first social compact in which the benefits and the burdens are unequally distributed, where some are the de facto burden-bearing class, while others de facto live off of their efforts. Again, that means if society begins to systematically impose burdens on some in order to benefit others, the citizens have the right to revolt. And third, notice that I said one transfers authority over almost all areas of one's life to the society. There are some rights for Madison that one has no right to transfer. This can be a little confusing, as I tell my students when I teach this in class. The world shouldn't be this complicated. I'm sorry it is. When the Declaration of Independence refers to all rights as being in some sense inalienable, it's using the term loosely. When Madison uses the term inalienable or reserved rights, he's using the term strictly. These are areas of life, the authority over which is permanently bound to the individual and can never be surrendered to governance, even conditionally. The prime example here is religious freedom of conscience. For Madison, government never has the authority to govern or even regulate that. It remains in the state of nature permanently. Okay, so a society has a great deal of power, but it's limited in these three ways. We come now to the second social compact, or what Madison sometimes referred to as the constitutional compact. life in a mere political society, life under only the first social compact, would be really inconvenient. For one thing, it's a pure democracy. No representatives. The whole people have to gather to approve every law. And if you recall your Federalist 10, that's set up for failure because it's going to be dominated by factions, groups that oppose individual rights or that oppose the common good, and thus undermine the whole point of political organization in the first place. So societies almost always set up an institutional government to make decisions for the society on a day-to-day basis. In the second social compact, the people of the society establish a constitution, acting as a unitary societal whole to transfer to a government whatever authority they choose. Now, importantly, this is another area where much of the scholarship gets Madison wrong, although the scholars who focus on Madison's thought, I think, by and large, recognize this. Institutional government has no impetus of its own, no energy that's strictly its own. It's not independent of the people, it's a vehicle, it's a channel for the society's will and nothing more. Its purpose is to act as the society's agent, channeling the society's decisions about how to achieve the ends that the political society exists to accomplish. And because governments are merely agents for their societies, the society can give or withhold authority at its pleasure. This introduces another limit on governance in practice. A society may transfer to its government most of the authority over its individuals, but then protect certain areas of life with a Bill of Rights or something equivalent. That's common in the state governments. The society may also grant only enumerated powers to the government, as is the case in the U.S. Constitution. But it's up to the society what authority it wants to give the government to use and what it wants to withhold from the institutional government. Okay, so we've got individuals in the state of nature who have total authority over themselves. They incorporate themselves into this political society that's really kind of got massive authority over the individual and it's democratic. But because that's not a good form of rule, we create the second constitutional form of rule by which the society allows an institutional government to make day-to-day decisions for it. There's one other difference between the two social compacts that we need to notice, and it has to do with revolution. Because the second social compact, the constitutional compact, is the deed of a unitary societal actor, simply choosing an agent for itself. It's an at-will grant. What that means is that a political society always retains the right to change its government, either partially or completely, anytime it chooses to. But notice that the first social compact is different. It rests on the pledged faith of a large number of individuals to abide by collective decision-making and to submit themselves to that. What that means is you cannot exit the first social compact except under duress. There's no right to break one's word and leave the society just because you changed your mind. Nor does the first social compact have any quasi-legal provisions for exit, with one exception, which is if you're migrating to another area outside the society's jurisdiction, you have the right to leave under the right circumstances. Otherwise, the only right to exit the first social compact without the agreement of the omnipotent majority is to claim the natural right to defend oneself if the society begins to act abusively. Okay, having run through an already fairly complicated system, there's one more complication that I need to throw out there. Because if we're going to talk about federalism, we need to understand how this applies to the U.S. Union, the American Union specifically. Notice, in 1787, when the Constitution is drafted, you don't have a collection of atomized individual humans who might form a first social compact. Nor, with apologies to Lincoln, do you have a united American society which might form a second social compact over itself. What you have, as we heard just a moment ago, are a number of sovereign states, societies with their own governments, that have formed a loose and swiftly failing treaty or league of alliance and friendship. What that means for Madison is this: the U.S. Constitution is both a first and a second social compact. It both creates a union, a society, and establishes a government over it. But here's the key. The individuals who form that society are not individual human beings. They're the state societies themselves. Remember, for Madison, a society is a much more human thing than it is for us. It's an artificial person, and it can do personish things like possess natural rights or like form a social compact, and that's what the states did when ratifying the Constitution. Also, one other detail here, as Madison points out in Federalist 39, and as we also talked about just a moment ago, the federal union, the American social compacts, are weird in that the state parties only partially incorporate themselves into a society. It's a real sovereign union, but only with respect to those areas of life that the state societies hand over for central governance. Okay. I know that's a lot of complication, but it's going to allow us now to answer some questions about U.S. federalism from Madison's perspective fairly precisely, but also fairly easily. You can capture much of it, I think, in a few propositions. Number one, the Union and the states both have real sovereignty. Many critics over the years have argued, again, you set me up beautifully, that sovereignty is a unitary thing, that it has to be either at the federal level or at the state level. Madison has none of that. Sovereignty can be split. Sovereignty is, in fact, always split when you're outside of the state of nature. That's just the normal state in which things are. And so it's not a problem for him that both the states and the federal government are really supremely the authority, really the people working through them, but for our purposes, those two areas of governance, over the areas of life that have been delegated to them. Two, the Constitution draws the line, defines the line between the areas of legitimate state and federal power. The Constitution is quite literally the act of speech, embodying the American social compacts, and thus it's a concrete historical transfer of authority that creates a central government and gives it a precise quantum of legitimate power. That precise quantum of legitimate power belongs to the central government, and nothing more does. Under ordinary circumstances, the Constitution is final, no matter whether it would be useful or expedient for it to be different. You can't construe power into the federal government that wasn't put there by the ratifiers. Either they gave it or they didn't, historically, Madison says. And so to seize more than was given for the central government, or to seize back some of what was given for the states, whether you do that by force or by sophisticated legal pedantry, is usurpation. It's illegitimate either way. So, how do we find that constitutional line? 3, the Constitution is what the ratifiers meant by it. This is subtle, but actually really important. The Constitution is not most basically a public legal text for Madison. It's not the language on the parchment in Washington, D.C. That text records an agreement by the ratifiers. But ultimately, it's that agreement, that act of will and intent, that defines the Constitution's meaning. This is important because an abstract legal text can be manipulated, sometimes a lot, by a clever interpreter. But again, for Madison, if the ratifiers did not intend to give authority to the central government, it's not there. You can't make it be there. 4, the courts are the final say within the constitutional system for determining what the Constitution means about this line. Madison was not particularly happy about this. He spent much of his time at the Constitutional Convention trying to persuade his colleagues to establish a system that would make Congress, rather than the courts, the final say on limits to the federal government's power, because the government is the instrument of society's will, remember, and Congress represents that most directly. But he also recognized what he wanted was not the system that the people had ratified, and so on his own principles, he had to defer to what had actually been authorized. Finally, 5, the states, as a collective society, political society, are the very final say, outside and above the constitutional system, on what the Constitution means. Again, this follows directly from Madison's compact theory. In the last resort, the whole institutional government, including the courts, is just an agent for the society, which is composed of the individuals who are the states. All of that brings us back to the question that we started out with. Madison endorsed state interposition in the 1790s. He condemned state nullification in the 1820s and 30s. Many have seen this as inconsistent. But once we understand the system of Madison's thought that we just walked through, it becomes obvious why not only could he make that distinction, but he actually had to make that distinction. Because nullification and interposition are actually importantly, subtly, but importantly different. Nullification is the theory that an individual state can, with final legal authority, judge a federal law unconstitutional and so prevent its enforcement within the state's borders. Some have made a big deal out of the fact that this was supposed to be done by state conventions in order to be just as authoritative as ratification had been. That's entirely irrelevant. For Madison, that makes no difference whatsoever. A state in the federal system, even if it in its highest capacity, is equivalent to one individual human being in a normal unitary society. And an individual, you or me, has no particular authority to interpret the Constitution and impose that on all our fellow citizens. On the other hand, the society acting as a whole is the final authority. And when claimed by nullifiers, Madison routinely pointed out that his calls for state interposition had always appealed to the states, plural, to act together, i.e. not as irrelevant individuals, but as the omnipotent society with the final authority over governmental institutions that existed merely to better express that society's will. This they could do, interposing, either at the level of ordinary politics by coordinating appointments of senators and presidential electors, by instructing their representatives in the House of Representatives and so forth, or at the constitutional level, by amending the Constitution, by replacing faithless actors, etc. There is no Madison problem. A society can act where individuals cannot. If we want to understand Madisonian federalism, really it all comes down to Madison's understanding of authority and the contractarian system by which he worked that out. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.